So, welcome to Wunschel. This class is The Power of Jewish Myth. Now, why Jewish myth? Well, it's a play on words. The first is that we're going to base a lot of our class tonight on this book. This is Joseph Campbell's The Power of Myth. And we're going to talk about Judaism in the context of this book and in the context of world myth. What makes us unique? What makes us universal? It's a wonderful book. The notes for tonight's class are above, so if you look above the chat room, you'll see a line that says, donate the text for tonight's class by clicking here. So click there, and you have the notes. So, let me have a little sip of water here. Feel free to ask any questions at any time, to interrupt. This is not a lecture, this is a conversation. And if you are watching this video after the live class, feel free to send me an email if you have any questions. So, what is The Power of Myth? So it was written by Joseph Campbell, who was a professor at Sarah Lawrence College, and really what made Joseph Campbell unique was he was the sort of first mythologist, for lack of a better word. So what his area of academic study was is taking myths and not necessarily looking at them from one perspective. People who read myths will look at them from a cultural religious perspective. They'll look at it from a religious studies perspective, from an anthropological perspective. What Joseph Campbell did is he looked at myths for the sake of myth, and that was something that really made him unique for his time. He taught for many, many years. He passed away in the 80s, but his books still really resonate today. Now, this book in particular is a dialogue between himself and Bill Moyers. Bill Moyers is the famous journalist, and the whole book is basically a script. It's their whole conversation that they had, and it's divided into themes. Now, the chapter headings are a little bit dubious because they don't necessarily stay on topic. They flow a lot from one subject to the other. So, as an example, let me just open up real quick here. I know I can tell you some of these chapter names. There's a chapter called Myth in the Modern World. And yes, they do talk about myth and they talk about the modern world, but they talk about a whole lot of other things. The hero's adventure, tales of love and marriage. They have little pieces here and there of those ideas, but really it's a dialogue between two people about really big issues. Now, what it really covers, what this book particularly covers, is the larger themes of myths and their relevance to today. Now, this book, I believe, was published in the early 1980s, mid to early 1980s, so there's a certain amount of time. Let's see, actually I'm saying 1988 was when my copy came out. So certainly there was a lot of time that passed since then. So the idea of, myth and the modern world or what's relevant today, it's relevant as of 1988. So we have to keep that in mind, that there is a little bit of a difference there. But to tell you why I chose this book, I chose it for two reasons. One, I read this book when I was 16 years old, and it really changed my life. I mean, this book really impacted me a lot. It really got me thinking about a lot of the things that I hadn't really thought about before. It helped me to really understand myself and to understand the world in a very, very deep way. So that's the first thing. The second thing about this book, the reason why I chose it, is that, as Chai actually mentions, there are criticisms of Joseph Campbell that he was an anti-Semite. And so it's kind of an issue for me of how do I reconcile that? How do I reconcile that he was criticized and considered an anti-Semite and all of these other things, and yet this book has so many profound ideas in it and things that I truly agree with. So it took a little bit of a journey for me to get to this point, and what ended up forcing me to do it is that this was actually required reading for school, for for my rabbinical training. So I had to read this book anyway, and so I thought, okay, well, if I have to read the book anyway, it's something I've been thinking about for a while, and we need to have classes here at One Shoal. I'm going to combine this all into one big deal. So that's why you're being forced to learn about the power of myth. So, I want to start with what is myth. So, let's start with that. Can you tell me what you think the word myth means? And if you copy from what's right in the notes, I'm going to be frustrated. Give me your own opinion of what you think the word myth means. And I'll throw out a few of my own thoughts. Fairy tale. That's what I think of myth. I think fairy tale, make-believe, pretend. Things like that. What are some other sort of synonyms? Fantasy, as Diane says. What are some other synonyms or ways of describing the word myth? Fantasy, but with a religious connotation. Sarah says something make-believe, not realish. Jenny says a story on which moralities are based. Okay, so these are all great answers. But let me tell you, myth is not the same thing as make-believe or fairy tale. There's two definitions that I have seen used for myth in academic settings. So the first is that myths are stories that are alive for a given culture. So what does that mean? That can be something like, as an example, our myths in the Bible, stories that are alive to us. It can also be ideas from history. So we could have the myth of American freedom. Well, we know that America is based on freedom, but what are the myths surrounding that? We could have the myth of democracy. We could have the myth of social responsibility. That's another kind of myth. So myth doesn't necessarily mean pretend story. It's something that is alive for your culture. Now, Joseph Campbell gave an amazing description of what a myth was. He said, myths are clues to the spiritual potentialities of the human life and or the experience of life. So what Joseph Campbell was talking about is the idea that we look at these stories and they're all about what it means to be alive and what our spiritual potential is. And that the myths speak to figures which are true to the human experience. So that's a really interesting way of approaching it. Now, that all seems well and good, right? That doesn't seem like anything we would, particularly disagree with. Chaim Mo mentions the Haggadah as a great example. Why would we disagree with that? Well, Jewish scholars of different stripes have taken different perspectives on Joseph Campbell and have had different sort of disagreements with him and his philosophy. So I'm going to give you a few examples. The first is, and I'm going to do this based on quotes, and I want you to tell me as I'm reading this quote why this might upset Jewish scholars. So the first one, you can't tell me that different myths across cultures are not the same stories. I've been with them all my life. They are timeless themes, and the inflection is to the culture. If you are not alert to the parallel themes, you perhaps would think they are quite different stories, but they are not. And then the second line is, all men are competent to know the mind of God. There is no revelation special to any people. So why might that upset Jewish scholars? Why might those two quotes be sort of upsetting? Diane says, well, the last one messes with Sinai. Okay, great point. And Kai brings it up. The second quote slaps us down. And again, the idea of chosenness. So we've all nailed it. So that's really the first issue, is that Joseph Campbell was essentially, and there's different ways of using these terms, so I'm going to use this very loosely. I don't want to get into a flame war about what this term actually means, but he was essentially a universalist. He believed in the idea that, all myths and all cultures had something to offer, and he actually, in the text, says that all of these religions work for the culture that they belong to. And so the question would be, if all religions are like commodities that work for a given tribe, then does that deny some sort of sense that we are the chosen people, or that there's only one God? How can there be one God who is our God, and yet Zen Buddhism works, and yet Hinduism works, and yet Christian Science works, So that, of course, would be one area, that people would wonder about, like, how can that work? And, also the idea, as Chaim brings up, of distinction. How can we be a distinct culture? How can we be a distinct religion, a distinct people, if everything is okay, right? So that's definitely the first issue. Okay, here's a couple more, 3 more actually. Tell me what you think about this. The Yud-He-Vav-He cult was a specific movement in the Hebrew community, which finally won. This was a pushing through against a nature god, which was celebrated all over the place. So that's quote number 1. Quote number 2, there is actually a historic explanation for the movement away from goddess worship, based on the coming of the Hebrews into Canaan and their subjugation of the people. The principal divinity of the Canaanites, is what it should actually say, was the goddess, and associated with the goddess is the serpent. The male god group rejected it. The third quote, the biblical traditions all speak with degradation of the so-called nature religions. Okay, so what do we think about these 3 quotes? So the first thing I'm going to say is Chaim brings up the word cult. So let me explain what the word cult means. We think of cult as, people like Jim Jones or the Hale-Bopp comic people, or one of these things. That's not actually what the word cult means. Cult is really another way of saying group. And it's a word that's used by sociologists and used by cultural anthropologists. It really is owned by a different time. To give an example, so Jenny says sect, and it's actually, if we want to get really technical, here's the difference. A sect is a group of people who break off from another. So that's how you have a sect. A cult is one that is original to itself. So that's really what a cult is. A cult is its own group with its own tradition, its own set of values. A sect is a group that breaks off from that. So that's really what the difference is there. So when you hear a word like cult, don't necessarily think that it means some like thing as we would understand, a cult to mean today, particularly in America. It doesn't really mean that. So what do we think about this? What do we think about some of these ideas that we're hearing here about the nature religions and all of that? Why do you think that would upset Jewish scholars? We have people talking about cults here in terms of Judy Garland and Madonna. Nice. So any thoughts on why this would upset Jewish scholars, the idea of what he's talking about here with Canaan and talking about, the idea of the Yud-He-Vav-He cult sort of being the one that finally wins over? Chaim says they are intimidated by the possibility that we are not unique and chosen. Okay, so that's a possibility. Are there any other, just on the surface, what does it sound like what he's saying here? What is it? I mean, it's there. We could really dig deep into it, but just glossing over the surface, what is Campbell saying about the Hebrews here? Jaimo says it denies biblical interpretation. That's true. You guys are all thinking way deeper than me. Living in living in a male-dominated society. Okay, bingo. So Diane said it in a very aggressive way. They're a bunch of chauvinist pigs. Okay, so the idea here is that, and Jaimo says tribal. So bingo. Now we're getting to it. So it's this idea that these early Hebrews went into Canaan and destroyed the goddess concept, that it was what Campbell actually calls an imperialistic god. And he actually makes a comment in the text that it's actually the only time in history that he knows of where one god concept, which is herding oriented, which is animal oriented, literally takes over the nature worship community. So his opinion of this was a very, cruel god, a god that is very imperialistic, and that since he couldn't find that at any other time during that history, that's something that made the Hebrews very unique, was this idea of going into the land and trying to destroy this goddess concept. And there's a lot of interpretations that he gives about the book of Genesis, and actually the first story in Genesis, Bereshit, about the Garden of Eden and all these other things, and that the Garden of Eden to a certain degree represents the goddess, and that there is a god there, and that the earth is damned, and all of these other things. So this is really where I think ultimately people really get upset with Campbell, is the idea that Campbell didn't understand Judaism, that he looked at it from a very paternalistic, a very tribal sort of view, and ultimately a fundamentalist view, and sort of painted a picture of the Hebrews as being early fundamentalists who were out to destroy the neighboring religions, the neighboring cults. So the question then is, okay, we like this guy, we like some of his ideas, they sound kind of cool. How do you defend that, though? How do you defend a man who clearly thinks that our God concept is an imperialistic, chauvinistic sort of entity, right? How can you defend, all of this? So I have a few perspectives on this. One is the fact that Campbell's view of Judaism was not based on Judaism, it was based on Catholicism. So Campbell grew up a Catholic. He ended up leaving the Catholic Church in his, sort of early adult years. It actually had nothing to do, this is his own saying, he left the Catholic Church not because of reading all of the myths and then deciding, okay, well, all religions are true, therefore I shouldn't be a Catholic anymore. He actually left the Catholic Church because, in his opinion, it didn't at the time. You have to remember, this is, let's see, I'm going to have to see. Let me look here real quick and see around what time period that would have been. Okay, so Joseph Campbell was born in 1904. So you're talking about a person who left the Catholic Church long before all of the changes with Vatican II and sort of what the Catholic Church is today. So he left the Catholic Church because it kind of it sort of collided with his ideas on science and things like that. So it wasn't from reading myths that made him somehow lose faith. But you have to understand that he viewed Judaism through the sphere of Catholicism. And here's a beautiful example. This is from page 47. In the biblical tradition we have inherited, life is corrupt and every natural impulse is sinful unless it has been circumcised or baptized. So I think that this is really an excellent point, that this is the way he is viewing the Jewish concept of the Garden of Eden and all of these other things, was from this very Catholic perspective. He saw the way that the Garden of Eden story was being told really as about the fall of humanity, the idea that there's, as Diane actually brings it up exactly, of original sin. So he's seeing it from a very Christian perspective, and a particularly very fundamentalist Christian perspective. Now, when I get into more of my defenses of Joseph Campbell, you'll see why he says one thing and then says something else, and this is where I kind of feel more comfortable with him. So I think that that's definitely part of the case. Now, Joseph Campbell did have his Jewish moments. He just didn't know them to be particularly Jewish. He saw them as sort of more universal, more academic, more based on his understanding of universalism and all of these other things. So here's a few quotes, and I want you to tell me what you think about this from your perspective. 3 quotes. The Garden of Eden is a metaphor for that innocence that is innocent of time, of opposites, and that is the prime center out of which consciousness then becomes, away from the changes, the wonderful story of the deity that said, I am. As soon as it said, I am, it was afraid. It felt lonesome and wished there was another, and so it felt desire. It swelled, split in two, became male and female, and begot the world. So here's another quote. People claim land by creating sacred sites to turn the land where they live into a place of spiritual relevance. So he was talking about, in that context, Moses, and then later he talks about Jacob. 3rd quote, getting back into that Garden of Eden is the aim of religion. When Yud-He-Vav-He threw man out of the garden, he put 2 cherubim at the gate. We're kept out of the garden by our own fear and desire in relation to what we think to be the goods of our life. So what does everyone think about that? So Chaimo has a question, which is, the Garden of Eden has no opposites. How does that work exactly? So in Campbell's view, the idea behind the Garden of Eden is that it represents a certain singularity, that it's before we get into opposites of male and female, God and earth, sin and virtue, all of these other things, and that prior to man's sin, as some might say, Eden represented singularity. So that's what he's talking about there. So what do we think about this? So Aaron says the idea of duality arises out of consciousness. So, that's where he talks about the idea of I am. The idea that human beings sort of came to understand themselves, and that the second that they understood themselves, that's when fear sets in, the loneliness sets in, because you recognize yourself, and then you recognize your difference from everything else. So Diane is totally confused. So you're going to have to explain to me a little bit more of what you mean by being confused, so that I can answer your question a little bit better. That's really what he's talking about, is this idea of, there is a time where we are pre-conscious, and that Aaron is actually doing the best job of explaining this, that when we ate from the tree, we gained consciousness, and then that's where all of these senses of duality came from, and that's where fear and loneliness sets in. So that's, a particular interpretation of this story. And I think that this is where I think this is where Campbell really starts to kind of get more Jewish all of a sudden. He starts to make a little bit more sense and to be a little bit more unique, let's say. So those are my thoughts. Any other thoughts? Anyone have any other ideas here? So Mo says, I say the story is just a story. Looks like we've got a lot of opinions kind of going around here. You know, I think personally that Joseph Campbell's understanding of the Garden of Eden is complex, but that's because he's a complex guy. And so I'm going to get a little bit into that. One of the things I didn't put on my notes here, but that I think is valuable, is another reason why Joseph Campbell was sort of not treated with the same kind of, I would say, with the same kind of openness as maybe other non-Jewish scholars who were interpreting the Bible and sort of Jewish myth culture, Jewish stories. Joseph Campbell had a very complex political ideology. He was not, I mean, you have to remember, this is a man who was born in 1904. He didn't support World War II. He was a non-interventionist. So immediately the thought was, okay, you know, here's a person who's an anti-Semite. So when you have someone who's a non-interventionist and then you have them saying what they're saying about these biblical stories, it's very easy to immediately think, okay, well, he is just anti-Semitic. Now, what's interesting about Campbell is that later in life he did support the Vietnam War. So that put him at odds. You have to remember he's teaching at Sarah Lawrence College, so this put him at odds with a lot of the other faculty. At the same time, however, he also really hated fascism and he really hated communism. So he was a complex man. He didn't quite fit into a perfect political mold. And I think that's part of the reason why he received a lot of criticism. I think had he just been a secular humanist, and had there not been the kind of turmoil in his 30s that was going on, I think that Jewish scholars would be a little bit more apt to say, okay, you know what, we'll take him for what he's worth. So I think that that was another issue that people had to deal with. So the next part of this that I'm going to talk about is how can we use Campbell to invigorate Judaism today. And it seems like we have, you know, a lot of dialogue about this. The idea of how do we believe in stories? You know, Aaron says, I don't believe in stories literally, but I read it as part of the culture. And so, you know, that's a great example. You know, and there are some things that maybe some of us have in common with Joseph Campbell. And Chaimo says, how many people in the world have a pediatric view of these stories as sort of truth, like true in the sense of historical truth? So that's a great point. Joseph Campbell offered a lot of different ideas about this, and some of which will seem to conflict quite a bit. And I guess that goes back to the fact that he was a very complex sort of guy. But here's a few thoughts on how we could use Joseph Campbell today in a Jewish concept. So the first thing that Joseph Campbell talks about that I think is very relevant to today's Judaism is the idea of the mysterium tremendum et fascinans. And does anyone know that? Has anyone ever heard that term before? It is the Mysterium Tremendum et Fascinans. It's Latin. Has anyone ever heard of this concept before? So Aaron has heard it before. It looks like we got a few other people who have heard it before. So to give a very quick description of it. So the Mysterium Tremendum et Fascinans, the word was popularized by a guy named Rudolf Otto, who was a theologian, and it has to do with the idea of the numinous. So I'm going to give you the quick sort of Wikipedia answer here. The Mysterium, it's Mysterium Tremendum et Fascinans. So Mysterium Tremendum is the tendency to invoke fear and trembling. And then you have the fascinans, which is the fascination and the compelling. So when you glue these two ideas together, the idea that you have the overwhelming mystery, and yet you have this fear that's with that. So how can you have the huge mystery and yet have the fear? It's kind of like a moth being driven to the flame. You know, that you have this thing in front of you, and you're overwhelmed by it to the point of fear, and yet you can't stop yourself. And so the idea of the Mysterium Tremendum et Fascinans is really sort of I would say, the center point of mysticism. So Aaron uses the term awe, and I think that that's absolutely perfect. So there's the idea of something being awful, which sounds like bleh, awful, right? And it's not awful in the sense of yuck. It's awful in the sense of it creates tremendous awe and terror. As Jenny says, you're terrified, but you can't keep away. So that's the exact idea. And so I think that this is really important. I think that this is key to a lot of issues that happen in Jewish life. And instead of waxing poetic on this, I'm going to go to my second line here, and you'll see how the two things kind of connect together. So Joseph Campbell thought in his time that religions were focusing too much on social issues. And so here's a dialogue between Bill Moyers, the journalist, and Campbell. So Moyers says, "Do you think that it is the absence of the religious experience of ecstasy, this denial of transcendence in our society, that has turned so many young people to the use of drugs?" And Campbell says, "Absolutely. That's the way in to an experience." And Moyers says, "And religion can't do that for you?" And Campbell says, "It could, but it's not doing it right now. Religions are addressing social problems and ethics instead of the mystical experience." So I'm curious what people think about that. What does everyone think about this idea of focusing on social issues at the expense, let's say, of the mystical? And to kind of give a little bit more background on this, in their conversation, they also move on to talking about fundamentalism and all of these other things, and specifically the idea of old-time religion. The idea that this was a time in the 80s when you had the idea of, old-time religion. It was the growth of Christian fundamentalism for the first time. So Aaron says, I don't think you have to, and have to meaning give up the mystical for the social issues. Tikkun Olam seems to bring both together. So I think that's absolutely great. That's a very good point. Absolutely. Any other thoughts on this idea of social issues taking more precedent over the mystical at all? Does anyone have any more thoughts on this? Is that something we do in Judaism? I happen to think we do, but I'd like to see some more people's thoughts on this before before I move on. So Aaron says, I've heard some people express a fear of the overuse of tikkun olam about that, and I agree. That's actually going to be sort of part of my thoughts on it. So it doesn't look like this is a very hot issue to anybody. So I'm going to go on ahead and give you kind of my thoughts on this. And my thoughts on this are summed up by this next line here. So Joseph Campbell at one point was talking about the rites and rituals of becoming an adult and how different cultures have these passages into adulthood. So what is that all about? And so he says the Jewish counterpart to adulthood ritual is the bar mitzvah. Whether it actually, and this is where the key is for me, whether it actually works to affect a psychological transformation will depend upon the individual case. Now, what is important about that? What does that actually mean? So what I think this is really talking about is, and part of this is what is being talked about in the book. They were discussing the caves in Lascaux. So in Lascaux, there's these, beautiful, beautiful caves that have all of this cave art drawn on the walls. So you have this work. I wish I had a really good picture to show you. They had all of this work of like drawings of animals and people spearing and all of that. Excuse me, all of that stuff. And what's interesting is that Joseph Campbell felt like we as a society had gotten away from that we weren't really doing this sort of thing, as Aaron uses the example of vision quests. So, absolutely perfect example. So what Joseph Campbell says here, where he's talking about the bar mitzvah, is whether or not it impacts a psychological transformation. When a kid has their bat mitzvah, do they really believe that they have become an adult at this moment? And in the sort of cultures which some would call primitive, that is the case. I mean, they really, you're circumcised as a teenager in some cases, or a young teen, so you're like 12 years old, 13 years old, the onset of puberty. If you're a woman, you go to live in the woman's hut, or whatever the case may be. Perhaps you go on the hunt for the first time. You are definitely no longer a child at that point. In the Jewish tradition, in the Western world, is that the case? And really the answer is no. Aaron says that he didn't feel, a big difference here. And that's really the case. In our culture, and I'll speak for America, you really don't become an adult legally until you're 18. Really beyond that, 21. And in some cases, if you look at today, there is sort of a continuation of youth and of childhood that's longer and longer and longer. So we have this concept now of the helicopter parents. And the helicopter parents are the parents who swoop in when their adult children are having problems. They hover over the kids, over their adult kids. Or as my father likes to say, there are no such things as adult children. That's an oxymoron. That's sort of very different from the cultures in which these rituals come from, where at the onset of puberty, at the moment where you are able to create life, you are removed from the concept of childhood. And so these rituals are part of a psychological experience. They're supposed to, as Joseph Campbell says, impart something on you. And, whether or not that happens to be the case, he says, is, that really depends on the individual. This last point that Joseph Campbell talks about is the idea of religions being particular to the individual. And this is something I believe strongly in. He was talking about the idea, this was sort of his last, if you want to call it, revelation, before he passed away, his last sort of thesis, was that the computer was going to be the next myth. You have to remember, this is the 80s, so this is a particularly interesting time in computer technology. You must understand that each religion is a kind of software that has its own set of signals and will work. If a person is really involved in a religion and really building his life on it, he better stay with the software he's got. I will never have an experience comparable to that of a saint. So the idea is that if you are deeply involved in a religion and you really are extracting from it as much as possible, you can have this mysterium tremendum et fascinans. You can have these mystical moments. You can have these intense moments of connection. And what happens if you, in the words of Joseph Campbell, he actually says, the full quote is, if you're a person like me who picks and chooses, I cannot have the kind of experience that a saint can. Now, does that mean that his life was unfulfilling? Of course not. He devoted his entire life to mythology, so obviously he got something out of it. But he would never have the kind of experience that he talked about. And, this idea of being completely raptured by something. As he says, and as Aaron says here, follow your bliss. That was the big Joseph Campbell thing, is follow your bliss. So here's my own sort of personal soapbox on this. And really, Jenny makes a great point here. Judaism has always stressed tikkun olam, but the late 70s, early 80s saw a strong resurgence in Christian social justice. The Catholic Church's programs in South America are a good example. So, I think that is absolutely true. I mean, we really see the growth of religions taking on, these sort of social issues. So here's my particular argument that I would make in the context of Joseph Campbell and in the context of Judaism. I think that to a certain degree, we have gotten away from the mystical experience, not because it's not relevant, but because it's easier to sell tikkun olam as a social political issue than a mystical one. So tikkun olam, in its original understanding, the phrase tikkun olam means to repair the world. So tikkun olam was actually a mystical, Kabbalistic thing. It was the idea that if you continue to do the mitzvahs, you continue to do the commandments, and you keep building it up, eventually the Messiah, Moshiach, will come. It's this world, it's repairing the world to pave the way for the Messiah. So that's really where it originated from. It was later taken, the idea of repairing the world was later taken and focused more on Jewish social justice. Now, I have nothing against Jewish social justice. I think that that's a fantastic thing. But here's what I think happened. It became so much easier to sort of sell the idea of tikkun olam in a secular Jewish way that it became sort of the default of the Jewish community. There has always been, and right now there's a big dialogue about it, this idea of half of all Jews are atheists, right? Like that's kind of the funny catchphrase, I guess is wrong. How about meme might be a good word. That there's all these atheist Jews who love being Jewish, but they're all atheists and they want you to know it. And that tikkun olam, by saying, well, the Jewish tradition teaches repairing the world, social justice, and as Abraham Joshua Heschel, great scholar and great philosopher, said, I pray with my feet, which is what he talked about when he protested with Dr. King, that every time he stepped foot, it was a prayer to God. When he was working within social justice, that's a very easy thing to sell to people who don't believe in the mystical or the metaphysical, because what you're teaching is this idea that you can be Jewish without belief, and that in fact there is tikkun olam, which can be your way of being Jewish. Now, that's fantastic, and I think it worked, and it worked great, but it has worked so well that it's actually backfired on us, because now more and more people, I think, are approaching Judaism not from the mystical, and so the idea of the mystical sounds like some sort of New Age thing. It sounds like it's either some Orthodox idea, or it sounds like it's some kind of New Agey, hippie renewal thing that people don't necessarily see as authentically Jewish in some way. And since renewal makes up 0.1% of the Jewish population, and Orthodoxy makes up about 9-ish to 10% of the Jewish world, you have the other 90% that would maybe fall somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. And so this is where people have sort of been attracted to tikkun olam. It allows people, I think, to forget that the sort of hippie, renewal-y ideas are actually ancient ideas, and that it's not bound to, 1960s Jewish Havura, whatever the case may be, and that it's not an orthodox idea and all of that stuff, to where you can only sort of engage in the mystical if you believe in not flipping on a light switch, let's say, on Friday night. So I think that this middle here is really stuck with this sort of very secular understanding of tikkun olam, and that's an easy sell. Here's another example. The conservative movement has written a new Machzor, a new High Holiday book. And one of the things they did deliberately was to try to make the Machzor more friendly to secular humanist Jews. And so some of the God language, there's like basically alternative meditations that are now written in. And these meditations take out the idea of the metaphysical. The ironic thing to me about all of this is that the conservative movement is therefore moving more Reconstructionist. So it's kind of, an interesting thing. But I think what's happened is that we figured out as a Jewish community, okay, we can sell tikkun olam. All of the movements now are focused on this sort of hyper-inclusion of secular Jews, still trying to remain God-centered to a certain degree, however they understand that. But it's tikkun olam, tikkun olam, tikkun olam. And that is actually at the expense of the mystical, because the mystical is much harder. It would be a hard sell. So to speak, for a rabbi of a Reform synagogue who may have a 25% secular community and say, okay, we're going to talk about interacting with the divine and connecting to God. That might alienate a certain percentage of people. And so the idea of becoming as moderate as possible so that you're not offending people or not, alienating would probably be the right term. That's a big part of it. So I think that that's the issue. But I think ultimately, Joseph Campbell's last line here, and this is what I'm going to end on, the idea that we all have software to a certain degree. We all have, we are all designed with a certain type of set of switches and knobs that work for us. And that if we delve deeper and deeper into that software that we are programmed with, that's where we are going to achieve the mystical. I think that it would be fantastic if that became sort of the cultural MO. As one friend of mine who is involved with the Jewish Meditation Center of Brooklyn says, it's the idea of digging up the ancestral wells. That you have these ancestral wells, whether they are ancestral from a physical standpoint of your grandmother and grandfather and all of that, or they're ancestral in the sense of our spiritual ancestors, that we need to continue to dig up these ancestral wells to the point that we are able to encounter the divine. So, that is my point on that. So, are there any questions with anything that we've covered tonight? Any objections? Anything? And so Jenny actually brings up something interesting. Often with organized religion working in the political realm, you ask, what's the true objective? And I think that that's, a really great point. I think we can connect that. I know the conversation was about Latin America and the Catholic Church, but I think we can connect that Jewishly as well, which is, what's the point? What's the point? Are we Jewish in the sense that we get together, we all belong to this thing called Jewish, and we all belong to it in different ways, and we get together at the exclusion of others because we just like being with other Jews? Is that really what it's about? Is it about tikkun olam? Is it about we're getting together to enact justice, which we believe is backed up by text? What is the end game, for lack of a better word? And I think that this is a really great point. And I would like to see, I don't think that there is a very good sort of mission statement for Judaism. And I would love to see the mission statement be connection with the divine, connection with the mystical, creating the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, and understanding that there are multiple approaches to that, but ultimately it's the same mystery. Because mystery is complicated. That's hard to explain to people. How do you explain a mystery? That seems like a really difficult thing. But that's the goal. That, in my sense, that's what it should be. It should be about the mysterium tremendum et fascinans. How do we help people to get to that point? And is it, in the middle of a Jewish yoga class, someone is in downward squatting dog or one of these other, I don't really know that much about yoga, but, they're in a certain position and all of a sudden they're sweating and all of that and they have the, aha moment. Sure, great. That's one way. Let's say you're doing a Jewish Habitat for Humanity, you have people building a house for Habitat for Humanity, and they see the roof being put on top of the house, or whatever the case may be, and they have the overwhelming aha moment as they see the roof going down as the sun goes down. That can be the aha moment, the mysterium tremendum. A lot of different ways. So I'd really like to see that be the focus. So. Anyway, fantastic. I'm going to give a few quick announcements. So tomorrow we have an open Torah chat. Now, the way that works is that it's not a live streaming event. It's, excuse me, it's just a chat. So everyone gets together in a chat room. It's at 7:30 Eastern Time tomorrow. And you chat about the week's Torah portion. You talk about whatever you're interested in. Carl is going to be leading a discussion on the Torah portion. You can talk more about this. It's just an opportunity to be together with the community and to discuss things that are important to you. So that's going to be tomorrow. We have lots of other great events coming up. One of the things I'm proudest about is obviously we have the open Torah chat. We have Rosh Chodesh, which is next Thursday, and then next Friday we are going to have, this is very big, we're going to have the first baby naming ceremony at One Shul. So we have a couple that are going to be leading the Shabbat service, and they are also going to be doing a baby naming for their little girl who is just born. So we're going to have Punk Torah, One Shul's first ever live interactive baby naming, and I'm so overwhelmed by how great that's going to be. So let's support our new prayer leaders, let's support this new family, let's support this new child, and give her the kind of community that she deserves. So please be there for that. Now, all of these times and dates are up on the One Shul website. They're on the Punk Torah website. You can't escape them. So no one can say they didn't know, because the schedule is everywhere. Last thing, if you live in the Chicago area or know someone who does, I'm going to be this Sunday at Chicago Limud. So Limud is a day-long conference. It's open to the entire Jewish community and non-Jewish community for that matter. And there's lots of great speakers. I'm going to be speaking. I'm also going to be filming the God Project. So if you live in the Chicago area or know people who do, let them know. Give them my email address so that we can connect when we're in Chicago together. And the last thing that we have coming up is Purim. So we're going to have pretty soon a Purim Bazaar. So what it is it's going to be a page on the Punk Torah website where you can purchase products that have been designed by the Punk Torah and One Shul communities. So we have kippot, we have artwork, we have, let's see what else. We have music, we have some shirts, I believe. We have all kinds of different stuff, and you can buy these products, and the best part is 100% of the proceeds will go directly to One Shul. 100%. So, there's no cost at all. People have been donating this stuff, with the exception of the cost of donating, the cost of shipping the products to you. Everything is covered. So we have some really great stuff, and it's all starting to come in. If you have a particular craft skill or you have a technical skill that you would be willing to offer the community, some other type of thing that we could sell within One Shul to fundraise for our Purim Bazaar, send me an email, patrick@punktorah.org, and let me know. Mail it to me so that we can put it up on the website. We're going to have little Mishlach Manot boxes, so we'll have little boxes of candies and things like that you can buy. So there's all kinds of great stuff that's going to be available, and that will all be up next week. So again, it's wonderful to have you here. It's wonderful to be a part of this community. Please support us through your time, through a donation. Again, you can email me, patrick@punktorah.org. You can give on any of our websites via PayPal. You can send a donation via check. If you cannot give financially, and all we ask is $5 a class or service, just $5. If you can't give that, and some people can't, donate your time. Donate 1 hour of time. And you would be amazed the kind of good that does. Not just for the community, but for yourself as well. Be a part of this community. How many of us do not go to synagogue? This is our synagogue. This is our community. Be a part of it. Be an active member in your community. Because this is for you. It's not my website. It's not some big organization's website. It's your website. So if you like this, if you like these classes, if you like prayer services that are online, if you like being a part of this community, please support it. Support it financially. Support it with your time. You can always email me anytime, patrick@punktorah.org. I have unless you email me at like 2 in the morning, I have about a 6-hour turnaround time on email. So I'll get in touch with you as quick as possible. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, I am here for you, whether it's about One Shul, something that's going on in your life, whatever the case may be. Send me an email. Let me help you. So anyway, once again, thank you for being at One Shul. I appreciate you, and remember how much you matter. Take care.